Thank you for that warm welcome, Steve. Can you hear me? Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's nice and loud. Okay. As Steve said, my name is Kandice Grossman. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about Standing Rock. My presentation is going to be looking at the politics of place and protection. This is actually work that extended out of my doctoral research. I completed my dissertation in the Department of Sociology here at MU a couple years ago in 2022. So since this research, I've gone on to the last couple years, I've spent researching health equity in rural Missouri. We did a statewide qualitative study. We're wrapping up the findings on that now. That's pretty fascinating and fun. And then also this year, I took a position as assistant professor of sociology at Truman State in Kirksville. So I've been very busy the last couple years, but I still feel really passionate about this subject. I'm really happy to be here. I also just want to say thank you to Missouri River Relief for having me. I've been a longtime fan and supporter of Missouri River Relief, so it's an honor to be here. I think the speaker series is just fabulous, brings so much value to the community. So I'm happy to share the knowledge that I've gained in my studies and in my experiences at Standing Rock, but I'm also here as a student. I'm a perpetual student, so I would love to hear as we go through the evening about your experiences at Standing Rock, or thoughts you might have as we go along, or questions. So yeah. Also, before I go any further too, I just want to offer an acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples who practiced and continue to practice culture and ceremony and life on these lands that we now call Missouri, including the Kickapoo, Osage, Oto, Iowa, and many more. So my goals for tonight are, I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about what the Standing Rock movement was, give you a little bit of historical context and background, and then I'll go into what my research questions were and some of the findings that I garnered from that study. Oh yeah, let's see here on my clicker. All right, so first I should just ask, how many of you here are familiar with the Standing Rock movement? I figured it would be, okay. How many of you participated in the Standing Rock movement? Okay, a couple people, all right. How many of you sort of like don't really know anything about the Standing Rock movement? Okay, all right, guys. I figured that might be the case with our amazing community here in Columbia. I know we have a lot of activists, so. But for those of you who are not familiar, or if you need a refresher, the Standing Rock movement occurred in 2016 and 17 and was led by the Osheti-Sakowin tribal members who gathered near the borders of the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota to an attempt to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, also referred to as DAPL. Okay, so DAPL is an 1,100-mile long oil pipeline that runs from the Bakken oil fields in northern North Dakota all the way down to southern Illinois. Running under the Missouri River Reservoir, Lake Oahe, which some of you might be familiar with, and also the Ogallala Aquifer. Okay, so the Oahe Dam on the Missouri River creates the Lake Oahe and is the only water source for the Standing Rock Reservation. And then, of course, if you're not aware, the Ogallala Aquifer is a vast underground reservoir that supplies water to the High Plains region over 8 states, and is one of the largest aquifers in the US and the world for that matter. It's also a tributary of the Republican River, which dumps in the Missouri River. So essentially, this movement was resisting the construction of this pipeline in the name of water protection because of all these water sources. It was also resisting the pipeline in the name of indigenous sovereignty, protection of sacred burial grounds, treaty rights, climate justice, and so much more. Over the course of 10 months, the resistance camps that were formed along the riverbanks grew to be a contemporary demonstration of mass coalitional effort. At the peak of the protest, it's estimated that there were more than 10,000 people in the camps. It's described as being one of the largest high-profile Native protests in 4 decades. And people came from a wide variety of backgrounds, right? So people were there from very different ideological, economic, religious, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. And so I was very interested in why people came together, you know, what motivated people to come and participate in this movement. So when we start looking at the variety of people there, we see there were members from more than 300 indigenous tribes from around the world who came and planted their flags on Flag Road. Many of you have probably seen pictures of that, right? Or if you were there, you probably saw Flag Road. There were many environmental activists there. There were some powerful political groups such as Greenpeace, Earth Justice. There were also thousands of US military veterans there. Including some veteran organizations such as Veterans Stand and Veterans for Peace. So again, I view this movement as sort of this space where there were diverse voices and narratives that came together in this public sphere to sort of address past problems and future problems, and is worthy of our time and attention. And I was also really especially interested in how well people across vast social differences got along, what motivated them to be there, and what was the role of place in their politics or their relationship to the environment. So it should be noted, well, so before I get into that, so what I'm looking at in my research is the politics of coalition. I'm looking at how well people got along inside the movement. I was very interested in that. What were some of the positives that we can maybe take away, and also what were some of the challenges. And then I was also very interested in this external coalition that was formed between public and private military forces that responded to the movement. Okay, so I'm looking at like sort of two different types of coalitions. Okay, so one is internal environmental justice activists, indigenous activists, and the other is sort of this intertwining of corporate and state military forces. And so I'll be talking about both of those tonight. So approximately 10 months into the movement, it was halted by the US federal government. National Guard was sent in. Pipeline was installed. Pipeline is still flowing oil now. It was actually Trump's first executive order in his first term in 2017, was to evacuate the camps and get the pipeline flowing. This is an issue that's still ongoing. Okay, the fight is still here. In 2020, a federal judge demanded that the pipeline be halted and that an environmental impact statement be generated by the Army Corps. In 2021, the Army Corps decided that it would keep the pipeline operational while it did its environmental impact statement. There have been some disputes about the fairness of the procedurals around this environmental impact statement, but in 2023, they issued a draft and are actually coming out with the final draft this year. So that should be published sometime soon. The pipeline still lacks a permit from the Corps to cross under Lake Oahe in South Dakota. So it's flowing illegally. In the meantime, some other interesting things have happened. The owners of the pipeline, I hear kiddos. That's great. The owners of the Pipeline Energy Transfer Partners, they have recently filed suit against Greenpeace. Anyone hear about that? So that's, they filed a massive lawsuit for $300 million, saying that they defamed the company, delayed construction, and caused financial harm during Standing Rock. Of course, Greenpeace is saying that this lawsuit is a SLAP, or a strategic lawsuit against public participation, basically an effort to silence free speech. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this unfolds. I think there's a lot of activists sort of waiting to see, like, if this works in favor of Greenpeace, this could be a good thing. If not, this could be devastating for future activism. So that's a very interesting update on the Standing Rock movement. All right, let me see. So here's a map of, it's kind of hard to see in here. I think it's pretty far away, but this is a map of the pipeline in red there. Up here is this, oh, I've got a little pointer actually. Ew, fancy. So right here is a Standing Rock Reservation, and sort of right here is where the camps were set up, right along the edge of the Standing Rock Reservation and the Cannonball River. Here's a list, you probably can't read it, but there's a list of 9 waterways that the pipeline crosses, and tribal lands under threat from pipeline failure, over 13 different tribal lands. And of course, I've got another slide here that shows the different watersheds that would also be impacted. So we've got, I'm sure you're all familiar with that as Missouri River Relief fans. And so before I go any further, I do just also want to take a minute to talk about, I'm going to go back to this one. Oops. Nope, this way. Yeah, back to this slide. I want to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about, to provide some history and context and background here. I am by no means a Oceti-Sakowin historian, okay? I have just sort of done my due diligence as an activist and as an academic and sort of have been trying to learn about the context and background. There's a lot of information, but I want to just kind of try and give an overview to sort of help you understand how the nation came to this particular point in their fight. So again, this is just a broad overview, right? But the Oceti-Sakowin Nation, or the Nation of Seven Council Fires, also known as Sioux Nation on some treaties, is a political confederacy, right? Made up of three linguistically related peoples: the Dakota, and the Lakota. People from this confederacy originally traversed regions in the northern and middle areas of North America, all the way up into like middle Canada, like in the late 1700s. They were then pushed further south by U.S. settlers as well as Iroquois nations. The Iroquois Nation, they were pushed down into what is now known as the Black Hills, which is like a 125-mile long by 65-mile wide stretch of mountain range. We're all familiar with that in South Dakota and parts of Wyoming. As U.S. settler colonialism expanded, eventually settlers encroached into the Black Hills. Disputes and wars erupted, and this ultimately led to jumping forward another 100 years to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, okay? Because of the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871, this was actually the final treaty made between the federal government and the Oceti-Sakowin Nation. It actually ended treaty making. But the Fort Laramie Treaty returned a 32-mile acre tract of land, including another roughly 40-mile acre hunting ground reserve, to the Lakota and the Dakota, and relinquished any hold that the U.S. government had on those lands, promised like no white people are permitted to settle on those lands. This treaty was violated within decades, based on the discovery of gold, the construction of railroads, so on and so forth. In 1980, actually, the nation, Oceti-Sakowin Nation, took this to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, who did rule that, yes, the Fort Laramie Treaty had been violated, and awarded the nation $17 million, but did not return the land or parts of the land that they were fighting for. And the nation refused the money and asked for the land. And of course, that was not returned. But I say all this just to sort of point out that the Oceti-Sakowin Nation has a long history of fighting for land and also fighting for the river. In the Lakota language, the Missouri River is Minnesosi, and is considered a non-human relative to the Water Nation, Minneoyete, and is very much understood to be, again, a relative, something that is alive, with personality, with power and agency, and not something that can be owned, okay? So the nation has this very long legacy of fighting for water rights along the river. When we look at the Fort Laramie Treaty, it declares Lakota lands to be defined by very specific boundaries, and the Missouri River actually defines that eastern boundary. Okay, so in the initial treaty, the eastern boundary was set on the east bank of the river along the low water mark. So therefore, it was stipulated that Minnesosi, the Missouri River, belonged to the Lakotas. Later in 1877 and 1889, Congress ended up taking more lands from the Lakota land base and ended up setting up the major Lakota reservations, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, Rosebud, with the new eastern boundary set in the center of the main channel of the Missouri River. Okay, they moved it. Moving forward, when the Lakota tribal government was established in the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe Constitution stipulated full jurisdiction over all waterways in their on the reservation. So there's just been this sort of ongoing struggle for where these boundaries are. But we can take away from this that the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 did declare the Missouri River Minnesota as under the jurisdiction of the Osheti-Sakowin Nation. Fast forward just a little bit, and again, I'm going to wrap this up, but to the 1944 Pix Loan Act, right, or the Flood Control Act, we see once again U.S. Congress encroaching on Lakota lands. When it called for the construction of 6 dams to control flooding and regulate crop irrigation, all those things. The Osheti-Sakowin tribal representation was not consulted, although excess tribal lands were relegated for the reservoirs that were built and purchased at very low prices from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So once again, there's this violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Many reservation towns were flooded. People were forced to move. Once the water stabilized in 85, the Standing Rock tribe demanded a return of those lands that weren't inundated with water and were awarded monetary damages. But again, this is just this. So when we fast forward to 2016 and we try and better understand what was happening here with this brief historical overview, right, we can see that this has really been an ongoing struggle for centuries, okay? This is nothing new. So let me let's forward here. Oh, that's not it. This one. So you probably can't see this either because it's such small text, but these are just some spills along the river. So not only was the argument that, okay, this is a violation of a treaty signed with the US federal government, but also the argument was that this is dangerous for our drinking water, right? And for everyone downstream. The idea is, the argument, I guess the reason, the logic is that pipelines leak, okay? And this was an argument that was made by activists, and that if pipelines spill into major waterways, pollution devastates not only, as I said, our water supplies, but it's also detrimental for human and non-human life, right? Violently disrupts ecosystems. So this was kind of the argument. And we know when we dive into the research around pipeline spills that yes, indeed, pipelines do leak, okay? When you look at the sort of the broader research, which if you're interested in this, the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, sort of oversees pipeline spills. You can go to their website and look at the incident reports. It's very interesting stuff if you're into that. But when you go there and you start looking up, okay, how many spills do we have, right? Is this an issue? You can clearly see that, yes, actually, pipelines do leak and they leak regularly. In the last 30 years, we've had more than 8,700 liquid pipeline spills. That's averaging about 1 per day, okay? Approximately 4.2 million barrels have been spilled in the last 30 years. Unfortunately, with this specific issue, it doesn't help that Energy Transfer Partners also, and its subsidiaries, Sonico Logistics and Dakota Access LLC, have a very bad track record. Okay, so since 2010, actually since 2002, there's been 106 safety violations. But since 2010, the government has fined the company and its subsidiaries more than $22 million for environmental and other violations. Records show that no company has had more hazardous materials leak in the past decade than Sonico Logistics. Okay, so this didn't help the matter either. It should also be noted too, so these are some of the leaks that happened in 2017. This was published by the Intercept media source. So as you can see here, you might not be able to see it, but it's sort of in the first year alone, there were 7 spills. Let's see. Yeah. And the largest one being down in Tennessee. See, it connects here with the Energy Transfer crude oil pipeline in Illinois. So the largest one was in that pipeline, and it was 4,998 gallons. It should be noted too that, as I was going to say, the Army Corps did not consult the Osheti-Sakowin Nation about the construction of DAPL. It has jurisdiction, by the way, over the approval of pipelines that cross major waterways. So not only did they not seek approval from us, the Shetty Nation, they also sort of went against the objections of the EPA, the Department of the Interior, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Also, it should be noted, one last thing, I'm just going to go back to this map really quick. So this, if you see here, Bismarck, oh, I have a pointer. I don't need to use my finger. Here's Bismarck. It's interesting because when the route of the pipeline was first being sort of designed, the original route went north of Bismarck. Okay. And the city council in Bismarck and some of the local businesses protested this for the exact same reason that the Shetty Nation did. Okay. The Standing Rock tribal government did, which is that we don't want the potential hazards, right? And we don't want this to potentially pollute our drinking water. So they rerouted the pipeline. This is a blatant example of environmental discrimination, or what we call environmental racism, which is a systemic form of racism that occurs when environmental practices or policies are disproportionately impact people who live based on their race or ethnicity or class. And so this was also a motivating factor in the protest. It was very obvious. All right, move forward. So getting into Standing Rock now. So my positionality, I do just want to state that, again, I am in no way a representative of the movement. I am in definitely no way a representative for the Shetty Nation. I am just a non-Indigenous white woman from rural Missouri, who is also, I consider myself an environmental justice activist, and I'm also an academic. My personal relationship to land and water very much informed this research. I grew up less than 10 miles from the banks of the Missouri River. I feel deeply connected to that body of water. And also as an environmental justice activist, I did participate in the Standing Rock movement. Okay, so I did a number of different things. I definitely did fundraising here locally, as did many of you. I also was a supply runner, so I took supplies up to the camps. And then I also did, toward the end, was doing this awesome like Amazon supply delivery thing where we were raising money and having supplies delivered that way. But anyway, here's me. And I'm standing here when I first arrived in Standing Rock in December of 2016. It was just a few days before New Year's, and it was very cold. Our truck had just slid off the road, and these veterans were kind enough to like pull us back onto the road. And it was in this very sort of moment where I started realizing, oh, this is interesting, right? Because the first people that we interacted with were a group of U.S. military veterans, and they started talking to us about their strategies. They had just moved camp. They were worried about flooding in the spring. So they were describing why and how they moved their camp and their logics behind that. And I started thinking, okay, so there are all of these different groups here, you know, sort of trying to figure things out and strategizing in different ways. I wonder how well they're getting along. So yeah. Also, I just want to say too, as a non-Indigenous researcher, I have continuously tried to stay attuned to the ethics of researching peoples and cultures of which I'm an outsider. Okay, so I've continuously tried to read Indigenous works, Indigenous critiques toward academia that come from other scholars, but also just people and communities, in order to not replicate some of the colonial informed, like problematic approaches to research. Okay, so there's that. So some of my research questions when I was, so again, I was there, right? I was going to do something totally different for my research, but when I was there, I was just so sort of intrigued by not only the activists and how well they got along, but also the military presence. And so when I got home, I decided to shift gears. I ended up staying involved in the movement long after it ended. I ended up bringing several activists here to Columbia to talk about the work. I moved one activist in for a while who was unable to sort of like transition back into everyday life. And she really helped me formulate some of my research questions too. But basically, what I was interested in came down to what can we learn about the possibilities for coalitional alliances across difference by looking at Standing Rock? Also, what can we learn about the challenges? And then what can we learn about the risks specifically from the militarized responses to Standing Rock? I'm going to be focusing on the possibilities and the military risks. I'm going to skip over challenges because in the name of time. Also, I had activists actually specifically request that I not focus on, like they're like, if you're going to write something on this or talk to people, please don't tell everybody all about the bad problems we had in camps. Like, don't make that your main focus. So I still have some writings on that, and we'll be happy to talk about it later. But today I'm going to focus on the possibilities of coalitional alliance that I learned about, and then also the military. A little bit about my methods. So this is a qualitative study. So that means that I engaged in interviews. I talked with 30 activists that participated in the camps during the Standing Rock movement. I also analyzed 13 stories from activists recorded on the Voices of Standing Rock podcast. I was also there. So I was taking notes. We call that participatory research and observation. Was involved, as I said before, for a long time after the movement. I also spent quite a bit of time on what we call document analysis, looking at documents that had been leaked from the Tiger Swan, which I'll talk about them in a minute, but it was a private military and security contractor that was present at Standing Rock. A few months after the camps were evacuated, an employee of Tiger Swan leaked hundreds of documents to the Intercept news source. They published them online, and I downloaded all of them and thoroughly analyzed those documents. And they included PowerPoint slides, security intel, memos, and emails. So that was part of my analysis as well. My sample was pretty much people that ranged in age from 20s to early 80s. They came from all over the US, the majority living in the Midwest and the Southwest portions of the country. I had 16 women, 23 men, one person who identified as gender non-binary. I interviewed 11 veterans, 6 white and 5 who identified as being Native tribal members. And in an effort to prioritize Native voices, the sample does contain a majority of Native people who either identified as being a member of a Native nation or tribe or as Indigenous as an identity. All right, so let's get to some of the things that I learned. All right, so when I started talking to people, I asked them, it should be noted too, that I was very interested in the relationship to place. I think I said that earlier, but like people's relationship with land and water and the environment and how that shaped their politics. But the first question that I asked everybody was, why did you go to Standing Rock? And I should be noted too, that everyone in my study were people who spent time in the camps. So Standing Rock was bigger than the camps. You know, there were people in cities across the country and across the world who were participating in this movement, either through fundraising or awareness raising, or there were many divestment efforts, artwork, and so much more. But what I was interested in is people who came together in the camps. So the first thing I asked everybody was like, why did you do this, right? Why did you pause your life and for some people leave for like months at a time? Some people were there the entire duration, the entire 10 months. What motivated you to do this? And after listening to activist stories on why they went, I realized that for almost everyone, they were very much motivated by this sense, this calling to protect, which together I'm just calling this shared calling to protect. And what I mean by that is to protect is to consciously transform, like from a mode of self-preservation to an other than self-protector, knowing that the two things are deeply dependent on the other, okay? For Indigenous activists, the calling to protect was primarily anchored in Indigenous place-based ethics, okay? Place is inextricably tied into what it means to be Indigenous. Place has been something that shapes Indigenous identity and culture. And it's very much grounded in the notion that place is a diverse state of beingness. It's alive, it's animated, and it connects all of humans and non-humans. So therefore, when place is in danger or is potentially threatened, it's in need of protection. So many people told me stories about how they were called to protect, that this calling came to them in visions and dreams, prophetic insights. And most Indigenous activists use the term water protector to describe themselves during the movement. Some of you probably might even refer to this movement as the water protector movement. When I asked activists what that term meant, many people said that they were actually not really happy with that term because it wasn't broad enough, right? That they felt like they were protectors of all of life, right? Human and non-human, and of the earth itself, but that just sort of worked in this particular context. So this sort of calling to protect place was definitely united Indigenous activists across very vast tribal differences. Many activists united who came from tribes that had been enemies for many years, that had had political conflicts, and they talked about this sort of rewarding experience of allying with folks that they traditionally had not. For non-Indigenous activists, because so of course I was interested in the Indigenous perspective. It was an Indigenous-led movement, and this made sense, right? Okay, this is sort of in line with Indigenous place-based ethics. But then I wanted to know, like, okay, what about non-Indigenous folks? Like, why did you go? Like, what, obviously, like, you're going to be coming at this from a different angle. And it was true. The call to protect was deeply configured by identity and relationship to a sense of place and home. Oftentimes, non-Indigenous activists talk to me about the homes that they grew up in. Okay. They shared stories of loss, oftentimes destruction or violence that they had witnessed. Stories about pollution or gentrification. They also talked about violence in their homes or discrimination in schools, things like that. And it was these original stories that inspired their calling, right, to take a protective action. Most non-Indigenous activists that I talked to did not claim the title water protector. I asked everyone. They definitely felt like that was tied to Indigenous peoples who were leading the movement and Indigenous ethics. But what I found here was that across difference, this call to protect, even though it varied across different, people explained it in different ways, that it was very much something that everyone referred to as their motivation to be there. A couple quotes to sort of support what I'm talking about. Simone here says, I think our highest calling as humans is to protect those that have no voice in the way that we do, and understanding our space within a greater ecosystem. We're all connected, and that's at the core of most Indigenous knowledge. Chaylon here says, there was a deep welling up inside of me to go. It's my obligation, my responsibility, and my commission to be a keeper of the land. And those are both two Indigenous perspectives. So the other thing that I found really interesting, again, when I was asking people about sort of why they went, what motivated them, was that what I found was that everyone in the study, again, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, shared critical responses toward what I'm calling like settler colonial conceptions of place, okay? Specifically, they talked about various forms of dispossession. So again, I kept hearing personal stories, but specifically stories about the loss of land, the loss of property, communal lands, the loss of community, and taken together sort of a sense of home that I'm calling a shared critical response, okay? And when I say like a settler colonial conception of place, this is obviously sort of in contrast to an Indigenous conception of place. I'm talking about like conceptions and traditions that very much are rooted in and centered on private property, individualism, the intertwining of corporations and state, hierarchies, right? Not only of like gender and class and race, but also with hierarchies of life, right? With human beings sort of being in the top of the hierarchy, a very human-centered approach to understanding place and the environment. And so what I found is that people responded to this. And what I mean by response, I'm talking about a critical response, a turning toward the problem, right? There was a pause in people's lives where they sort of hunkered down, right? They took root, if you will, and questioned the sort of common sense of these conceptions of place, right? And kind of went, wait a minute, like either again, a lot of times it was based on prior original experiences they'd had, but also just witnessing some of the, the news and the things that they were learning about this movement. And they took a pause. Donna Haraway calls this type of political response a turning toward that creates responsibility. So I kind of like that. But anyway, it was really responses to these different prior experiences and then what they were seeing at Standing Rock that again called them to engage and unite across difference. So when I talk about dispossession too, it's important, of course, to recognize that when we think about dispossession in a historical context, particularly keeping in mind practices of colonialism and slavery in the US, that dispossession is racialized, it's disproportionately experienced, right? But at the same time, I did continuously hear these different stories about dispossession. So some of the examples were historical and ongoing theft of native lands, forced displacement of native peoples, negative experiences with eminent domain laws, negative experiences with urban gentrification, this sort of psychosocial disconnect and displacement and dispossession that comes with living and working in the military, and also with living and working in the agricultural farming industries, okay? So it was really these experiences that led to a sort of chipping away at the legitimacy of colonial capital structures and systems. And so some of the quotes that I want to share that sort of backed up why I'm claiming this. Modi was a really interesting activist who told a really impactful story about his childhood, in which he reveals how when he was a kid, the Colonial Pipeline Corporation had laid pipe in his family-owned property in Georgia. And he describes the story of his dad just being like outraged, right? Like saying, wait, I own this property. I pay taxes on this property, but based on eminent domain, they were able to lay pipe, and not only once, but twice, actually. And he tells these like really sweet stories about him and his brother, waking up early in the morning that they were coming in, the workers, and they were ready to go to war. And they go, these two little kids go out and, were like throwing dirt clods at the workers. And needless to say, of course, that they didn't win that fight. And the pipeline was installed. But he said, here I was, I fast forward in my life and I hear about this pipeline and this fight in Standing Rock. And I thought, okay, maybe I can actually do something at this time. And then another example was from Raina, who grew up in a military family. And he says, I had no roots, no long-term relationships with people. You have no idea where you are, where you live, what you're standing on. And that's what ties me to Standing Rock. He has really spent most of his life trying to figure out his relationship to place. Like, what does it mean to be connected to place? And I even asked the question, his identity is as a white man. And he even asked the question, what does it mean to become native to place? Which I thought was a really interesting question. So these are just a few of the quotes that sort of, again, shared how I came to some of these findings. So I think just out of this sort of this line of thinking around possibilities of coalition, I would just argue that I think, and I have to use my notes on my computer for this one, that I think that what this study teaches us is that at the heart of place is this sense of home, right? And that human beings are, all of us, longing for a sense of belonging and home. Whether that be, a sense of self or identity or a sense of rootedness, that we all essentially have that longing. And many in this study had lost homes, whether it was like personal homes or ancestral, homes. And many were longing for a new kind of home in the future, right? How can we maybe recreate our idea of home? And I think that this study reveals the ways that settler colonialism disrupts that sense of home for both the colonized, and the settler. Hold on, I'm trying to get to my notes here. I don't know. Nope. Okay. Oh, here we go. Yay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, just along those lines, I think it was this longing for home that essentially brought people together across social differences. And I think that it can be used as an analytical tool for future research, but also for future mobilization of groups, right? Specifically around within environmental justice and climate justice movements. So I'm going to skip forward through some of my other findings just for the sake of time. I also looked at the role of identity in coalition efforts and found that identity can actually be, can create alliances across difference, even though we usually hear bad things about identity. But again, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump forward and talk about the risks and impacts of military violence. So, yeah, so again, I was looking at not only the internal coalitional politics, but the external coalitional politics, and this sort of alliance of public and private military forces and the ways that they impacted coalition work internally. So despite the fact that Standing Rock announced itself as a peaceful prayer camp, it engaged in and taught daily nonviolent direct action techniques. And in fact, every activist that came through was required to engage in those nonviolent trainings. The military response was excessive. Okay, there were organizations from all over many different jurisdictions, including local police, police from surrounding jurisdictions, the Morton County Sheriff's Department, state police. There were several federal agencies there, Homeland Security, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Border Patrol, National Guard was there. So there was this significant state response. There were also a number of private military and security contractors who were hired by Energy Transfer Partners. As I said before, Tiger Swan being the one who was there the longest, had the longest tenure at Standing Rock. Tiger Swan is a North Carolina-based corporation that originated in 2005 as a U.S. military and State Department contractor to help execute the global war on terror. Okay, so it specializes in corporate risk management, risk mitigation, and security and stability operations. Typically, prior to this, it was contracted with the Department of Defense in international sort of scenarios. We've seen a rise of private military security contractors since the Cold War, but definitely since the Afghani and Iraq War, they have significantly grown in number. So most of their contracts were in a war context, okay? It's estimated that like by 2005, there were as many private military boots on the ground as there were like federal military boots on the ground in Iraq, okay? So they've become this sort of integral part of the Department of Defense approach to military action. But this is one of the first times that we really see them in a domestic dispute, okay? Now, we've seen them since then, and I foresee that we'll probably see them even more. But in this case, what was interesting was while they were there, the activists knew what was happening, right? There's this private military, they're working alongside this public military, but the public really didn't know. Media sources weren't talking about it. It wasn't really till after the camps were evacuated that we learned, right, when these documents were leaked. So what I found when I started looking at the impact of this coalition on activists was that it was excessive, what I'm calling excessive militarized repression. Specifically the use of militarized weapons and tactics and operations, as well as overt violent actions and arrests, inflicted harm and trauma upon the activists at Standing Rock. This trauma was oftentimes compounded for many because it was layered on top of already pre-existing trauma, whether that would be historical trauma or PTSD from war for many of the veterans. And then the violence and trauma that was enacted by the military or these public-private military alliances also further endangered the physical health of activists, including numerous cases of injury, disability, and even death in one instance, which I'll talk about. I feel that this subject requires our attention, our special attention, specifically in this post 9/11 context, right? Where we have extensive legalized surveillance, right? And we also have this emerging private military industry that specializes in counterterrorism and counterintelligence. At the same time, we're in the middle of a climate crisis, right? That sort of serves to disrupt like economic and social norms. And within that sort of global war on terror context, in many cases, we see this rhetoric as the climate issue as a national security threat, right? And so at Standing Rock, I in the Tiger Swan documents, I saw over and over and over again the activists being framed as terrorists. Okay, so I think that, and of course, this again, I should state, is nothing new for many Native activists, right? If we can trace this private mercenaries all the way back to for many years, and the sort of ongoing Indian wars and how it shaped the military. But I think what makes it different and unique is this specific post 9/11 context, right? And when I say excessive repression, what I mean by that is, the attempt to control or constrain or prevent protest. Okay, and I believe this was excessive militarized repression from the state and the sort of private corporate military. So what do I mean by that? I'm just going to give you some examples, right? So essentially what they did was they created what appeared as a war zone. All right. So how many of you went to the camps? Right. So you remember there were lights shining on the camps all day and all night. I don't know if they were on all day, but they were definitely on all night. Okay. They employed the use of militarized vehicles, helicopters, military equipment, riot gear, weapons. It was definitely a war zone-like environment if you were there, right? You could feel that immediately. The list of weapons that were employed included a range of riot control agents, such as tear gas canisters, but also a range of what's called kinetic impact projectiles. And that includes things like rubber bullets, spinning baton bullets, concussion grenades. Some of you might have seen the images of water cannons being sprayed on people in below freezing weather. Security attack dogs were used. Anyone remember those news clips? Those were actually private security attack dogs. The National Guard actually set up 4 Avenger missile launchers aimed at the camp, which is an Avenger missile launcher is a mobile surface-to-air short-range missile system. It's a weapon of war. It has this forward-looking infrared capabilities and video capabilities. So essentially, it can record activities all night. It's okay. I think that went well with the Avenger missile. So anyway, yeah, so I know, I feel like it's like pointing at me again. But in all seriousness, it really did this profound sense of intimidation and fear in the camps. It was argued that, oh, well, this is cheaper than an Apache helicopter. It can record activities all night, but it was also just like pointing at the camps. And so there was, several tactics that were specifically focused on intimidation. There was also extensive ISR, which is a military operation of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which basically involved a lot of infiltration. Okay, so people going undercover and acting like an activist in the camps and causing complete chaos. I heard so many stories from activists. So once I kind of got past the conversations around, why did you go? What was it like for you? They quickly wanted to talk about the military presence and the impact that it had on them. People spoke to me for hours about the impact. People cried, people wept about the sort of the fear that was generated and the trauma and the violence that they experienced. And it was a range of different actions, including like racial discrimination and slurs, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and direct assault. So what I found in the study was that the impacts of these tactics and these methods on activists ranged from, psychological harm to severe physical harm. Yeah, and I think that what this reveals to us is that one of the biggest challenges for future movements, right, is this coalition of police and state military forces and private military forces. They play a significant mediating role in crushing democratic movements. We've seen it in the past, but what's different now is that corporations can hire their own private security militaries, right? And so that adds another layer of complexity and makes it difficult for resistance. So a couple quotes that sort of support what I'm saying here. Matt talks about they were prepared for war. I mean, they had MRAPs there, and MRAP is basically a shielded tank on wheels, not on tracks, but they're used in Iraq and Afghanistan to run over bombs. And they had them at Standing Rock at a peaceful protest. Modi, who I talked about earlier, this quote says he died in that truck. The doctor knew it and I knew it because I felt it the minute he collapsed. He shared a really profound story with me. There were actually two activists that sort of corroborated on this story. They were different interviews, but they told me the same story about a Lakota man, a U.S. military veteran who was hit by a concussion grenade in his chest and ultimately collapsed. The other guy that told me the same story told me that like when it happened, a tear gas canister had sort of landed right in front of him. Like he sees this guy go down, he gets hit with a tear gas canister and it was so hot that it like melted his contacts. So he couldn't see. So he runs back to, the medic camp to get help for this guy, Raf. And somewhere in here too, Modi is also sort of running to the rescue to help this guy. And both of them, a medic soon comes, but he says that, it was pretty clear to everyone that he went into cardiac arrest from this concussion grenade. Luckily, the medic was able to revive him. Okay. But both of them talked about trying to stay in touch with him over the years after the movement and learning that he was suffering from severe mental health problems, perhaps because he lost oxygen to the brain for several minutes. He was dealing with homelessness and things like that. So it's a very sad story. Both of them cried telling me this story. Modi was there when he sort of came back to and stayed with him for the rest of that night. So essentially, I think that my key conclusions, which you can't really read these, but basically, I think that the story of coalition work at Standing Rock has many things to teach us, right? It offers knowledge and insights on the ways that people coalesce and come together and get along. It teaches us about the ways that place unites us across difference and the challenges and risks for alliance in U.S. society, especially now, okay? In the face of environmental degradation and climate disasters, the activists at Standing Rock, led by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges, offer us a successful and effective example of human coalition in the name of care and in the name of protection of our shared home. I think that this story reveals that Indigenous leaders and knowledges and Indigenous ethics must be central to all imaginings and shapings of the future. I also think that Indigenous leaders are crucial to all decisions made, especially for environmental justice movements and climate justice movements. Indigenous nations and knowledges offer long practiced, long memoried environmental stewardship, okay, as well as long memoried practices of resistance and insisting that the government stand by its word and be accountable to its commitments and upholding rights. I think this study also teaches us, as I said earlier, that at the heart of place is really a sense of home, and that humans are all longing for a sense of belonging and home. And I think that, again, as I said before, this shows us how settler colonialism really disrupts that sense of home, but also the ways that it can be intentionally recreated and co-created. Finally, I just want to say, I think that what this study taught me was about how US culture relies on a cyclical pattern of violence enacted by the military and police and private forces to uphold and justify its interests, whether that be land theft or other capital interests. And this cyclical pattern of violence has changed over time based on specific context, but it remains the same in many ways. And I think that my work, my findings reveal and shed light on policymaking regarding laws that regulate private military forces, and reveal the need for policies that regulate these coalitions and uphold democratic principles, specifically of accountability, transparency, and protection of human and health safety. So I just kind of have listed on here: place creates possibilities, place work brings people together, Indigenous knowledges must be recognized and at the forefront of future imaginings, and democratic principles must be considered in policy surrounding regulation of private military. And I think that is kind of a wrap. I feel like I have talked forever and ever. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so happy to take questions now or hear from you all about your experiences at Standing Rock. Anything. Yeah, if you have a question or a comment, if you just raise your hand. So people on Zoom can hear you.
I'm just really curious, since they forced or took the land and went ahead and put the pipeline under the Missouri River, correct there?
Yes, under the reservoir.
Okay.
Missouri River.
Are they actually, since they're having problems with what's going across the earth leaking, are they actually even made to make that pipe better than what's going across the land to where it won't leak? I mean, or at least has a good possibility to not leak?
Yeah, I mean, pipeline safety is kind of an ongoing concern for everybody, and definitely including for pipeline owners, right? And there are certain tests ongoing that all pipelines must go under, and there are certain critiques around some methods, varying methods. My dad's a pipe fitter who worked on oil pipelines, interestingly enough, as a kid. We followed the pipelines, lived in North Dakota for a while. And I know that there have been, yes, certainly debates around the way pipeline is laid. I know that in recent years, the quality of materials has denigrated, and even some of the quality of the work, which I hope my dad's not listening, but, it used to be that you would get these union contracts, and more they're doing these sort of private contracts, which is cheaper for the companies. And so sometimes there's arguments that the quality of work is decreasing. But yeah, I think that's an important piece. And in the environmental impact statement that's being formulated by the Corps, there are sort of alternatives, right? Like, what else can we do? And one of the options on there is, how can we make pipelines, this pipeline anyway, because this is what the statement is regarding, but how can we make them safer? And that's certainly a big part of this conversation, or an important part. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Question over here.
I was among those who was attending at Standing Rock. I tried to go with a very open mind and simply learn
Yeah.
as much as I could. One of the things I learned, because we whites were discouraged from being on the front line of confrontation, because the tribal people were afraid of us. A lot of the military response was It was not simply irresponsible or excessive, it was provocative.
Yes.
It was definitely provocative. That's one of the things I learned. They wanted to provoke violence, and they were afraid that we whites, who might have had a superficial commitment to nonviolence, would turn to violence. And the
Yes.
whole thing would be catastrophic. So
Yes.
they were afraid of us. They wanted us there. They wanted our support. They wanted our friendship, but they were very wary. Second, the grandmothers were afraid for us because we didn't know how to take care of ourselves in the cold, and they were afraid that we would really, really stress their very limited resources
Yes.
with hypothermia, with malnutrition, with drug problems, with alcoholism and so forth. And so they had very, very mixed feelings about us. And so the cross-cultural coalition
Yes.
is an iffy and tenuous thing unless we whites are willing to re-ground ourselves deeply in nonviolence. Because we couldn't be at the front line, we went and attended a tribal meeting, a tribal council of the Standing Rock when we were there. And one, it kept us from dying of hypothermia. And second, we got to know the tribal people in that way by attending their meeting. We did not speak. We just simply listened and watched. That was tremendously valuable. Also, another, you can't overstate it, the complicity of the media in suppressing this event.
Yes.
I mean, some deranged person, it's horrifying, shoots up a school or something, and if I'm going to say it, a few people die, but this went on for months and months and months, and the very short-term attention span of the media is a dangerous issue.
Yes.
Is a dangerous issue for the American public, because they just dash from one crisis to another crisis to another crisis, and really being informed. Thank you for your work, is very difficult. It's really very difficult to learn anything from the media.
Yeah.
And that is a big problem. And it's just a short attention span. It's the drama of it. And that was one of the learnings I brought home that was very concerning to me.
Yes. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think, my findings could corroborate everything you've said. Certainly the challenges within coalition work too. When I talk about coalition work, and I didn't emphasize this in my talks, but I'm not talking about this sort of like sitting around a campfire becoming best friends coalition work, right? This isn't really about that. I think some people confuse the idea of coalition work with, oh, well, that means I have to, to love everybody. No, not at all. I'm talking about people coming together with shared political interests. Right. And learning how to do that across difference is uncomfortable, right? It's unsettling, right? Especially for, I think, white people trying to ally with Indigenous folks. But yeah, I appreciate all of your points. I think your first point too about not being on the front lines. I'm not sure when you were there, but at certain points in the sort of duration of the movement, they did start actually training specifically white people to be on the front lines after so many sort of Indigenous people kept getting arrested, much more so than the white activists. And so, so finally they were like, okay, so maybe we can put certain white activists. And so they were actually specifically trained on how to sort of protect Native activists, particularly women activists, and the grandmothers, but everyone. I think it's really interesting too, that in many cases, some of those frontline activists were US military veterans. And many of the workers, many of the private military employees were US military veterans. So there were these very intense and tense moments in the movement where you had US military veterans sort of nose to nose. And yeah, I think it really demonstrates this sort of very unique position we're in our democracy right now about what it means to uphold the Constitution and to make that commitment. But thank you for sharing all of that. Yes.
Experience was one that was slightly different in that I felt very comfortable and accepted. There were some horsemen that would be up on the mountain there and watch us. I felt like I was where I needed to be. I was drawn. But learning from them was wonderful. In the morning, they would have a prayer session at the sacred circle and the sacred fire. And the elders would speak in their language, and then they would, interpret what they had said. And then in the evening, going to sleep was so wonderful because the children were laughing and playing, and they were singing in native tongue and drumming. And that's how I fell asleep every night. And I was told, as we all were told, the white people, go back and tell this story for us because, none of us could be here. And I was probably drawn because I had studied the horrible history of the indigenous peoples. And one book that I read before I ever went there, many years before, was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, or is it Bury My Soul at Wounded Knee? They said that there wasn't a treaty that wasn't broken. And how does that pretend from now? I'm sorry. Especially with the current administration. I'm leery about a lot. But love is the answer, right?
Thank you for sharing that.
I just want to ask a question. So I don't see any hands. I wonder just how many coalitions have formed or did form during that time, not only at that place, but just even here in Columbia, there was a group called Como Water Protectors or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, wow, this thing like really brought so many different coalitions together. I just wonder, wow, how many were there? It's just, yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm with you in that, yeah, it really did stir people and move people together, right? And I think there's a number of reasons for that, some of which I talked about, right? But also I think, yeah, the movement did a really good job of using like affective language around like the purpose of this, right? That this is emotional, this is spiritual, this is about this shared place, right? That essentially to cohabitate is a form of coalition, really. Like we're all in coalition, actually, whether you want it to be or not. And how do we do this? How do we move forward and protect this shared home? So, but how many? I don't know. And I think that's why I wanted to study this. I feel like, to your point about the media, this movement really was not given the media attention it deserved. I think a lot of Indigenous-led activists get lost in the media. They also get lost in scholarship too. They don't get a lot of attention as far as what can we learn from this. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Test 1, 2.
Yes.
Wonderful presentation, Dr. Grossman. Thank you very much. Early on, you were showing maps, and I was kind of surprised at the extent of the pipelines. It basically went from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, it looked like. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious, where is this oil refined and who sells it? Because I would like to boycott.
Right, exactly. I don't actually know the name of the refinery. I mean, I know that it goes to numerous different refineries. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer on that one. That is a really good question. Yeah, so we could boycott. There was certainly a movement during, an effort during the movement to divest from banks that were supporting or funding the construction of the pipeline. That was very effective. That hurts, right? And that's sort of why Energy Transfer Partners is, coming back with this. But yeah, I'm with you that might be something we can engage in again and moving forward. I know there are a lot of economic boycotts happening right now. But yeah, I don't have better information about that right now.
I have a peculiar perspective on this. I came to Columbia to join KOPN Radio and lived in housing collectives. And as a result of that, in 1979, someone visited me from West Plains area of Missouri about the creation of a thing called the Ozark Area Community Congress, which was is a group of people trying to organize people of like and separate ideas around bioregional principles of we share things in common because of the bioregion we live in, the watersheds that we live in, the connective lifestyles, the botany and biology. And a lot of that was also taken from Native American pre-Columbian Native American organizations in some part, or romantic back to land things, but with that whole interest. So in 1979, they held this Congress, and I went there as well as a lot of other Colombians, and we were kind of coalesced around with each other through food co-ops, which were interconnected regionally, maybe even bioregionally, living situations, home co-ops. The cooperative living situation I was in was listed in the community's catalog. We owned 3 adjacent properties and shared things in common. We were networked with East Wind, other communities, and that was 79. In 1980, the Lakota Nation called for people to gather at the Black Hills for a Black Hills survival gathering in response to, I think, Union Carbide and other corporate moves to try to get the Black Hills designated as a national sacrifice area for large-scale coal and uranium mining. And the opposition of the tribes was the same as the opposition to the pipeline, the tainting of the water. And at the watersheds, a group of us from Columbia went up to that, participated in it for several weeks. I got to talk with people in council, where I told them about KOPN. I suggested that the movement could be facilitated by them seeking out other seeking to get radio stations. And, they may have already been underway. There was stations in the Madison area. Minnesota did that. Anyway, heard a powerful speaker, John Trudell, who had been part of the Alcatraz takeover, speak passionately about how we are the next victims, how we are the next Indians, talked about displacement, about taking care of space. So my motivation for going back to Standing Rock was as a continuity of bioregional consciousness, networking through cooperations, and Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Was talking regularly about Standing Rock, and
Yes.
still does. I
Yes.
mean, when we talk about media being a poor source, that right now, we've fought back multiple times, not for profit and non-commercial radio attempts to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and that's geared up now. So long ago, I heard that a Belgian revolutionary said freedom of the press is only guaranteed to those who have a press. Well, freedom of speech is only guaranteed to those who exercise it and collectively, cooperatively
Yes.
provide themselves with the tools for that, like this program tonight, like this,
Yes.
like our streaming exercise, like the media that we do have and can support. And I think,
Yes.
you know, when they say, you know, we build coalitions, we build coalitions. I mean, the 46th annual Ozark Area Community Congress is scheduled to happen in September, late September of this year.
Fantastic.
I'm going to be there again, as will Mark Heim and a number of other people.
Mhm.
And last year, there were people from bioregional organizations across the country in representation. So we're not alone. There's nothing being done. I mean, if you feel alone, you feel nothing is being done, it's probably because you're not doing anything and haven't engaged with someone. And I encourage you to do it. And you know, that's my perspective on this.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yes. And also, I would just say, yeah, shout out to our local radio and also Missouri River Relief, who has actually been doing work for so long now to increase, like to help people's relationship with place, right? To foster that. One of the reasons I just love everything you all do, and not just like sort of in an abstract way, in a very like physical way, like through education and getting kids out on the river. Okay, I'll stop. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Oh.
It's so good. Thank you. And I know there's more questions, but I am
Okay.
jumping in line.
Okay. Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, and if you want to sort of sit on this and come back to it, feel free. But I was just wondering if there was a story of place and coalition just from you going up to Standing Rock and being engaged in that, something personal. I know a lot of things happened, but if there was something personal that sort of is an example of kind of the stories that came out in your work afterwards, that is like a mirror of that.
That's a great question. I have so many stories that kind of led me to this interest, right? The one that pops to mind first. So is I mentioned earlier that there was an activist I met who was working in the camp. She was running a kitchen. It was one of the main kitchens there in the Osheti-Sakowin camp, and was a fascinating person. So we met while I was there. She fed me. I brought her firewood. It was an instant sort of connection. After the movement was over, we stayed in touch, and I ended up, as I said before, having her come to stay with me and sort of help her get back on her feet. I arranged for her to speak at University of Missouri and Stevens College, where I was teaching at the time, and she did great with that. And she was having some like financial issues, so she ended up living with me in my house and my kids for like, I don't know, maybe several months. I don't remember the length of time, but it was challenging. Because she was a Lakota woman who had this very complex background and was a lifelong activist. And me being this white rural Missourian, we had a lot of differences in our backgrounds and our viewpoints about the world. And we didn't always meet eye to eye. It wasn't this like, oh, we're instant friends just because we were at Standing Rock together at all. But there were also some really good times too. We had a lot of fun together. But I think what was special about it for me was just the fact that like, because we had both been there and we both had that same interest, right? That same value, that kept us sort of connected through it all, like no matter what, still to this day, despite the fact that we had some clashes and conflicts. And so I think it was my relationship with her specifically, that inspired me to look at sort of some of this. And what coalition really looks like. Like, as you were saying, it's not always this grand political action. Sometimes it's helping someone out for a few months, right? Who's homeless because they were doing a grand political action, or it's, giving somebody gas money, so I think that, yeah, I think that experience probably stands out as being one of the most influential, but I had a lot of positive experiences too, locally and in the camps. And well, I mean, it was a positive experience with her. It was just, I think it also showed how like our differences are unsettling, right? Can be tense, but so important, right? We're all in this messy, complex life together, trying to get through this. So, but thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So in the Standing Rock, you had, many, many people from all over the country from different backgrounds coming together, and some of them forming lasting connections over the years.
Yes.
I could see that in the future, there will be other occasions for us where people will have to get together to achieve a common goal. Could you give us a few takeaway points of the things that worked and galvanizing people and that were actually productive and produced results, and maybe a few things that shouldn't have happened that were counterproductive?
Yes. Again, some of the things as far as like pulling people together, I've talked about it in the slides, but I think a focus on the things that the common interests that we have, the shared values that we have. As I said before, there was a lot of affect, a lot of emotional language and discourse that was used to motivate people. The Black Snake prophecy was, some of you maybe heard that, but it's, this Lakota prophecy that this black snake would come across the land and bring destruction, and that people would have to make a decision on how they responded to that. And that those images and those stories and the artwork that I think emerged around the movement definitely appealed to a wide variety of people. But also that value of protection and care, like the U.S. military veterans, the leaders, indigenous leaders, the Shetty leaders, several specifically had asked for U.S. military veterans to come. They put out a call. And I think that appealed, right, to the sense of protection that U.S. military veterans are trained to have, right? And so I think there were several things like that that definitely helped create this coalition. Yeah. Also, I would argue, I was going to not argue, but I was going to point out with some of the other comments that were made tonight, the culture of the camps itself, like the place of the camps themselves, were also, I think, made for profound experiences for activists who were there. Everyone I talked to talked about what a life-changing experience it was to be there for a number of different reasons. There was a sense of community. There were teachings every day from indigenous leaders, but there was also a recognition that there are all different sorts of spiritual beliefs here, right? So a lot of times the water ceremony practice in the morning, there would be different leaders of that ceremony, right, who would acknowledge different belief systems. It was based on a barter economy. There was no money exchanged in the camps. Healthcare was free. All food was free. I mean, it's sort of like one of the activists I talked to called it like the city of the future, like this sort of this, rare place that many of us have never experienced before, right? And so I think the place of the camps itself also kind of helped spur this alliance and coalition. As far as the challenges go, I spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of coalition work with people. Interestingly enough, activists didn't really want to talk about that. When I asked them what were some of the challenges of working with people across difference, right? People would avoid the question. They wanted to talk about the profound experiences of being there, the life-altering aspects, and then also the military, right? That was a big focus. So I had to sort of draw it out of them. But when I did, some really interesting findings came out of that. Primarily, I think one of the biggest challenges has already been mentioned tonight, which is that white activists had trouble sort of not trying to run the show, and sort of listening and honoring Indigenous leadership. And so there were a lot of complaints about white activist behaviors. So I took a deep dive into some of that analysis, ended up calling it like white blindness. Okay. So my advice to like white activists who want to ally with Black and brown or marginalized groups would be to recognize your social positionality, right? There was an example brought up earlier about surviving the winter. I heard so many complaints from Native activists that you know, several white activists would not respect the real dangers of the situation, right? That this was a political movement in which there were, you know, militarized missile launchers pointing at the camps, and instead there were activists who were, you know, putting on like Santa Claus outfits and treating it like a party. Or one specific story I'm thinking of was this activist was complaining about a white activist who kept walking around barefoot in the winter, like as it was getting cold. And the irresponsibility there of like, and the not recognizing the weight of sort of like, you're coming into this situation and you don't know how to survive in this climate, and just stop, pay attention, right? Listen, follow instructions and rules. And so that was one of the biggest complaints. There were also numerous complaints about gender relations. Indigenous women were definitely the backbone of this movement. But there was some conflict between some of the Indigenous men and women, and I heard stories about that. There were also numerous sexual assaults in the camps. So there were a number of different problems. This wasn't sort of like, you know, what did one Native activist said, this wasn't an Indigenous paradise. Okay. Although there were all of these amazing things happening there, there were a lot of problems. And so, yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway though would be for, you know, white activists who want to align and coalesce with Indigenous movements to really learn to listen.
Right there, but I would not call it problems. I would say there were concerns. There were
Right.
concerns. But from my
I
point
heard
of view,
concerns,
it
yeah.
went remarkably well. It was incredibly well disciplined,
Yeah.
and it remained nonviolent. And we whites contributed not very much to the drug problem of the Standing Rock youth. I mean, they were worried about that, and
Yeah.
they had reasons. They have reasons to worry about that kind of stuff. And they didn't even want us to engage in vulgarity. Just watch your mouth, because that is disrespectful. And disrespectful talk among white people can be almost automatic. And so even that cultural issue was
Cultural etiquette.
a concern. It was a concern,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it went amazingly well.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. And I think that's why activists were like, don't focus everything on this part. Okay. But here were some of the problems. Okay. And yeah, this cultural etiquette, cultural sensitivity, that was not there. Like understanding our ways, right? That this is how we want this camp. This is how we want this peaceful prayer camp to be led, and to how we're going to keep it from erupting into violence and things like that. But yeah.
So my perspective doesn't come from going to Standing Rock. It comes from hanging out in bars with attorneys for the Corps of Engineers. And
all right. Okay. Interesting.
and that perspective really showed me that the conflict at Standing Rock was entirely avoidable, but our regulatory system in this country failed. And the thing that really surprised me is that there is no national regulation on oil pipeline right-of-ways. If it's a gas pipeline, there is. If it's a electrical transmission pipeline, transmission line, there is. Oil pipelines are regulated piecemeal, state by state.
Mm-hmm.
The only federal interest came when the pipeline crossed the river.
Mhm.
So the Corps of Engineers, the excuse that they made was that by the time it came to them to approve or disapprove or do their alternatives, the pipeline had already been completed on both sides.
Mhm.
And the national perspective that should have taken indigenous rights into account in the pipeline right of way never happened until it just got to the crossing itself. So if we had a better regulatory framework
Mhm.
for
I
oil
agree.
pipelines, this whole thing could have been avoided.
I think that's a really important point. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Any other questions, comments? I think we're good. Thank you all so much for sharing all that great information. I'm going to take this off.
Well, I just wanted to add one additional thought. Just thank you so much, Candice, for sharing this tonight. I think this is just like it's a really important time to have conversations like this. It's easy for life to move on. This happened 6 years ago, 9 years ago. Yeah. But what you shared with us today, what was taught and learned and struggled through at Standing Rock is so important for us to keep in mind today, and what these issues of place, these issues of coalition building are so important right now. And just can't thank you enough for bringing that and sharing that with us, and sharing it. Now we can all, if you really enjoyed this and you got a lot out of it, it'll be on YouTube, and you can share it with friends that would have wanted to have been here, but maybe whatever was going on. It's beautiful out tonight. So yeah, thank you for that. And one other thing I just wanted to mention, like earlier this year, we were able to screen at Ragtag a film called End of the Line, the Women of Standing Rock. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, just look it up. You might have to pay $5, to the filmmakers. Totally worth it. And it really starts with some of the women that started the movement, carried it through, and did the hard work after everyone left. It's a really powerful film that I would totally recommend. So thanks a lot for coming tonight. David, thank you so much for making the sound work, and Candice, really appreciate it.